Welcome to Polaris Live. This is your host, Sarwar Kashmeri, with conversations on the US-China relationship and its global impact as seen through the eyes of experts from around the world. This viewer-supported channel is brought to you in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. This program comes to you live, so if you wish to ask questions, please feel free to do so using the bar at the right-hand side of the screen. My guest today is Elina Noor from the Carnegie Corporation. Elina Noor is a senior fellow in the Asia program at Carnegie, where she focuses on developments in Southeast Asia, particularly the impact and implications of technology in reshaping power dynamics, governance, and nation building in the region. Welcome to Polaris Live, Ms. Noor. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam, Sarwar. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a real pleasure to have you, and thank you for taking the time. Now, many experts believe that the huge power differential between the US and China, on the one hand, and Southeast Asian states on the other, means that countries in the region will increasingly have little choice but to bandwagon with China, the neighborhood superpower. Is that how you see it?
I think it's not so much how I see it as how the region itself is trying to navigate these power dynamics between the US and China. And the reality on the ground is that countries are making very different choices on different issues, different topics, depending on their circumstances and depending on what is at stake. And so you see, for example, Thailand, which is a US treaty ally, arguably the oldest US treaty ally in the region, working very closely with China on technology issues, for example. You see Singapore, which is not a US treaty ally, not formally anyway, also trying to balance its relationship between the United States, which has a presence militarily in Singapore, and China's economic ties. And so you have this, I think some theorists call it hedging, that's taking place amongst the different countries in the region. And so the facts on the ground are very checkered, very complex. And I think, unfortunately, what the view that is often from Washington is one of a very reductive landscape in Southeast Asia.
But in a sense, Elina, haven't the countries in Southeast Asia lived with this paradigm over the centuries, right? China has always been the central power, so to speak. How has the present world changed that, you think?
That's right. I mean, thanks for bringing up that historical fact, and the trajectory of the reality in Southeast Asia has been this complex mix of balancing relations between, I guess it was the Middle Kingdom in the past, between even the Indian Empire, and this mix of civilizations in Southeast Asia has always been present in its history. And now we're seeing a different kind of dynamic play out, but with very similar characteristics, where you have these power centers, either in the region or further afield, often come into contact with each other, whether it's cooperatively or in a more contrasting or conflicting manner. And in this case, the US and China we see today. But somehow, whether it's by fault or by deliberate means, Southeast Asian countries in the past as now have somehow managed to stumble or very carefully calibrate their relations with these different power centers. And I think the one thing that's very different now, of course, is the overlay of technology and technological development and developments and evolution in the relationship that is complicating these power dynamics.
Is it complicating? I wanted to ask you, actually, as a follow-on question, the role and impact of technology in reshaping power dynamics in Southeast Asia. I know that's a focus of your studies and your expertise. And I'm going to try and bring in the experience of Ukraine in fighting Russia, because it's a small power, large power situation. But Ukraine's been using inexpensive technology against a much larger power, Russia, as in $1,000 drones to destroy Russian tanks. Do you think there's any lessons to be learned from what's taking place in Europe for Southeast Asia?
That's really very interesting, bringing in the Ukraine angle. And it's true. I think one of the lessons of what we see between Ukraine and Russia is Ukraine has been called kind of the battlefield of drone and AI and cyber warfare in its standing up to Russia. And certainly we've seen a lot of help from private tech companies that has made this war a little different from the rest and in the past. Brad Smith himself, the head of Microsoft in 2022, said that the war by Russia against Ukraine is not just a matter of a war between two countries. It's a war that involves an alliance of other countries siding with Ukraine, also an alliance of tech companies that is helping Ukraine out. Microsoft itself, along with Google, have helped Ukraine try to defend its technological space and cyber systems against Russian aggression. And I think for Southeast Asian countries, there are at least two lessons to be drawn from what's happening. One, that you don't necessarily need a lot of sophisticated, big weaponry in the conventional kinetic sense. Those days are still maybe somewhat pertinent, but with the advent of technology, less pertinent. And two, I think that the war in Ukraine has certainly shown that once you are able to maneuver that information battle space through the collection of data, for example, from these $1,000 drones that you talk about, some of which are even made of cardboard and rubber bands, as I understand it, then you can really change the equation, even if you're standing up to a much more powerful conventional force like Russia.
Well, let me throw out something that just came to my mind as you were speaking, Elina, and that is this: that for whatever reason, Russia does not seem to have the will and the resources to end this war very quickly against a far smaller country. Were this another situation, for example, let's take the United States and a small country. The United States would have acted very differently, pulled out the communications of the other country, just gone in, ended the war. So do you think that there's a chance that Southeast Asian countries, if they get the wrong lesson from this, might actually aggravate the situation and underestimate the power of another country?
That's certainly a possibility. But I think a really important lesson for Southeast Asia from what's going on in Ukraine is that Ukraine is not just a small country. It's a small country that's helped by larger countries, by, again, a conglomerate of tech companies. And so really it has very powerful allies and friends that has propped up its defensive effort in Ukraine. Were Southeast Asia, any Southeast Asian country, to find itself in that unfortunate situation where a much larger country is being an aggressor against it,
right,
I'm not sure that it would have that full might that Ukraine has managed to avail itself in terms of support.
Fascinating. I'm going to tangent a little bit to you moderated a panel of experts from Southeast Asia, I think about 3 years ago, under the title America's Back. And the theme was selected to contrast the previous president, Mr. Trump's approach of America first to then incoming President Biden's more inclusive view of the world. Well, we are almost at the end of Mr. Biden's first term. Did America come back from the Southeast Asian perspective, if you can answer that?
Oh, Sarwar, 3 years seems like a lifetime ago, especially since it was during COVID when timelines blurred very, very significantly.
Yes.
But I do have a vague recollection of having moderated that panel. And I think my cautious optimism still stands to a large degree when contrasted with President Trump's administration. The Biden administration has made itself felt in Southeast Asia. At least on the superficial level, I think a lot of Southeast Asian pleas for the US to take Southeast Asia and ASEAN as a grouping seriously on its own merits have managed to get some traction. So, we've heard rhetoric from the United States, whether on its own or through partners and groupings that it is a part of, whether it's the G7 or the Quad, emphasize ASEAN centrality. And that's good, right? But I don't know if we've managed to move any further beyond just that rhetoric. Because, for example, I wrote about this last year, President Biden chose not to attend the ASEAN summit, sent Vice President Kamala Harris instead, which is still a huge deal. It's the office of the vice president, of course, but it's not the US president. And there's always been an expectation in Southeast Asia that if the US is sincere about taking Southeast Asia seriously, then the president himself should be in attendance at the ASEAN summit. It's not like President Biden was elsewhere. He made a trip to India for the G20 summit and then went to Vietnam, but then chose not to attend the ASEAN summit, which is unfortunate. And these kinds of absences stick in Southeast Asia for quite a while. So regardless of what Jake Sullivan might say about the US's commitment to the region, unfortunately, these little blips in the relationship are what some Southeast Asian governments will choose to remember.
That's so interesting. You of course brought in the topic of ASEAN, right? The grouping of 10 countries, if I remember correctly, that has become kind of the nucleus of Southeast Asia's relations with one another, right? It's not really an alliance, as I understand it. Tell me what you think is the real importance of ASEAN, of which I'm a great admirer, and my friend Kishore Mahbubani always talks about ASEAN as the central piece of Southeast Asia. Tell me what that means to Malaysia. You're from Malaysia, and to you.
Well, I'm a huge fan of ASEAN. I've been critical of ASEAN, not because I don't believe in it, but because I actually do believe in it and think it can do better. I always find it a little amusing when non-Southeast Asians talk about how wonderful ASEAN is, which to me, warms my heart. But within ASEAN itself, Southeast Asians are constantly wringing their hands over just how effective ASEAN has really proven itself to be. That said, so I think, if you look at just the three different pillars of ASEAN, the political pillar, the economic pillar, and the sociocultural pillar, ASEAN has clearly made huge advancements in the economic pillar. ASEAN back in the 1990s, if I'm not mistaken, created a free trade area for itself. It, if you remember a few years back, basically spearheaded the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which unfortunately has been reported in a lot of media as having been China-led. And this is absolutely false, right? RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, is this huge trading agreement that took about 8 years, if not longer, to negotiate and was an ASEAN baby. And if you look at GDP growth, if you look at poverty levels over the years, ASEAN has really done well for itself when compared to 1967, when it was first brought together with just 5 founding partners. Politically and on the security front, I think you can quibble about just how effective ASEAN has been. But to me, I personally believe on that front, the fact that we've seen no major outbreaks of conflict, we've seen some disputes, border disputes here and there, sure, is testament to ASEAN's success itself. The South China Sea dispute, of course, is something that's a bit of a flashpoint right now, but that's not a solely ASEAN issue. Where I think it has failed a little has been in the socio-cultural pillar. Because if you ask, and many surveys have been done about this, if you ask your regular 15-year-old in Southeast Asia whether they know what ASEAN even means, I think a lot of them will struggle to give you an answer about what the acronym even stands for, let alone what it stands for in terms of values and ideals.
So listening to you as an American, the message that is left with me is that no matter what you think of ASEAN, America needs to be involved with it, because that is, in fact, the future of developments taking place there, correct?
Absolutely. And to be fair, the US has been involved in the region for a very long time. It is one of the top FDI contributors in the region. But I think the gripe and a feeling of resentment among some Southeast Asian countries towards the United States when it comes to ASEAN matters is that the United States has never taken the region or the grouping seriously, except and unless it's for the advancement of US interests, which to a certain extent is fair. But when you look at kind of the 20-year history of US ASEAN relations, US Southeast Asia relations, a lot of it has been premised on, at the government level at least, on military and security ties, not so much on the economic front. And I think this is one of the deficits of the US Southeast Asia relationship right now. You have, of course, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, but that has been launched in fits and starts, and we haven't really seen much progress, as you know, over the past year or so.
Let me interrupt by reminding our viewers that Polaris Live is a non-commercial channel. I need to switch this off. I should have done that earlier.
There might be a sponsor calling in, Sarwar.
What?
There might be a sponsor calling in.
Might be a question that we can't answer.
Right.
No, I was going to say, let me remind our viewers, Polaris Live is a non-commercial viewer-supported channel. Please help us grow by subscribing to our YouTube channel and adding your name to our mailing list at kashmiri.com. There's no cost. It really helps us grow. And now back to our guest, Ms. Elina Noor. So Elina, tangenting to another topic, slightly sensitive one. Southeast Asia is predominantly Muslim, right? I'd like to ask you whether the hugely negative view generated in America by Muslims around the country after 9/11 has changed, again, from your perspective as a Southeast Asian.
Fundamentally, I mean, my personal view is that it hasn't changed very much. We've seen some, I think, improvement over the years, but only because the issue of terrorism has sort of died down in the frontal lobe of many Americans. But I think there is a very troubling undercurrent of just how Muslims are treated that is beginning to resurface now with what is happening in Gaza. And you've seen the abuse, the mistreatment, some even horrific incidents. Remember this little boy who was killed by his landlord just because he happened to be Palestinian and Muslim. And these diatribes are beginning to resurface, unfortunately, which points to something deeply unsettling and fundamentally xenophobic, in a sense, if I can be blunt, about not all Americans' sentiments, but I think at least a portion of how America feels about Muslims. And that is felt as well by the Muslim majority population in Southeast Asia.
Right. And so even though Southeast Asia is somewhat removed from the center of Europe or from where Ukraine is, what you're saying is this sentiment, the Muslim sentiment, really carries forward into the larger Muslim community around the world, and that we don't seem to be as sensitive to it for whatever reason as we should be.
Yes, or just unable to demonstrate some compassion, empathy, sympathy towards what Muslims are feeling, especially now, given the political climate in the United States.
And, I couldn't help but be reminded of what you have just said. Just a day ago, I think Mr. Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, said that 30,000 Ukrainians had been killed over the 2 years of the Russian war. And a lot of people read that and said, that 30,000 Gazans have been killed, mostly women and children, in 2 months as opposed to 2 years. So I think that this kind of thing ricochets amongst people who don't put the geopolitics of it together. We could go on with this, but I'm going to now look. I'm looking at the screen where there's some questions coming up, Elina, and here's one to respected Elina Noor. Ma'am, does USA and the People's Republic of China have any strategy to resolve Myanmar military rule in Myanmar, which used to be called Burma, in the medium to long term in Southeast Asia? Do you feel this is an issue that you might want to tackle?
Sure. I mean, Myanmar has been a really politically difficult issue for even the population of Myanmar itself. And Southeast Asia has always found it a challenge, even when Myanmar was brought into the ASEAN family. It was Malaysia, actually, that argued for the inclusion of Myanmar in the hopes of getting some traction for a real and lasting political change by having Myanmar within ASEAN. Unfortunately, that has proven to be not so true. And since the coup, what we've seen, of course, is real desperation by the Myanmar people to get things reversed politically, but also a real sense of frustration, exasperation by the youth of Myanmar towards ASEAN. And I think this is not so much an issue between the United States and China, or whether there are avenues for cooperation. Certainly, there are avenues for cooperation between the United States and China on the Myanmar issue. But first and foremost, this is an issue for the Myanmar citizens to resolve. It is what they want that is of utmost importance. And in the immediate neighborhood, Southeast Asian countries can support Myanmar citizens in that case. Only when there is a call for other countries to be involved, then I think that should be taken up by those other countries.
Thank you for that. So, during the Cold War between the Soviet Union, the US, and USSR, actually collaborated, Elina, in a number of projects, and one of them was fighting smallpox. Successfully, I might add. Now, with your experience, can you tell us if you were to pick one area in which China and America could work together to better our relations, does anything come to mind?
Climate, right? We're having a climate emergency unfold before our very eyes. And there is some movement on that front between the United States and China. And so I think we all wait with bated breath to see how far that cooperation can proceed, particularly with the US elections coming up this year. And that may or may not throw a spanner in the works, but hopefully the little progress that both the US and China have made on climate cooperation can continue regardless of what happens in November 2024 in the United States.
Let me explain to our American audience, tongue in cheek, that all of us in Southeast understand what a spanner is. But for the American audience, a spanner is a wrench. So I thought I should make that clear. But a side question to that, Elina, I am tempted to think that one reason why we've not made that much of headway between China and America is, and I want you to poke a hole in this, the word communist. In America, when you use the word communist, it means something very special because of the huge Cold War during the time of the USSR, right? And that lingers. And you can't raise this topic in a drawing room without drawing laughter and saying, are you kidding? How could we ever work with a communist country? Do you think the word communist actually by itself acts as a roadblock for in America?
In America, yes, I believe that's the case. Although to be fair, because of the communist insurgencies faced by some Southeast Asian countries during the Cold War, including Malaysia and Indonesia, the word communist still has a certain baggage attached to it. So the word communist is very sensitive in Indonesia, for example, also sensitive in Malaysia, perhaps not as sensitive as in Indonesia. But it doesn't have that giant connotation in the way that it does in the United States. And I'll explain. Because, for example, Cuba is often dismissed as a communist regime. Well, Malaysia has ties with Cuba, with communist Cuba, if you will, right? And it's a socialist country, really. And we have students studying in Cuba. We have ties with North Korea even, and many countries in Southeast Asia do. So although there might be some disdain for the word communist in Southeast Asia, it does not carry the same import that it does in the United States.
That's so interesting. I grew up in India, and I remember we always have a small communist party in India, and the saying used to be, I just was just thinking about it this morning, that if you're 15 years old and you're not a communist, you don't have a heart. But if you're 25 and you're a communist, you don't have a brain. So
that's hilarious. I mean, given the history of India, I can see how it makes sense. But Sarwar, if I can just add, it's funny to me because while many Americans might dismiss communist China or look upon it with disregard, it has no qualms engaging with communist Vietnam, for example, for different reasons. And so this distinction between one communist model and another really sometimes elicits puzzlement amongst many onlookers.
It's listen, I'm going to take a bow. A listener just wrote and said, great quote by Mr. Sarwar Kashmiri, laughing out loud. He says, well.
It was really good.
Now, listen, we're running out of time, but I did want to ask you, there is a lot of talk about the change in the so-called Western-dominated world order, right? That the center of gravity is shifting eastwards, where the growth, and progress will be in economies for the next decade or two. Number one, do you subscribe to that conversation? And two, how would you advise U.S. officials to fit in? What should U.S. do if you were able to talk to key U.S. officials to fit into this emerging world? So it's kind of a two-pronged question.
Mine is a biased view, but I do think there are some really interesting and exciting developments in the global majority, global South world that we're seeing. And I'll give you a specific illustration of that. In Southeast Asia, you can now make cross-border payments in local currencies. So there's no need for exchanges to be made into the US dollar, for example. This facilitates and smoothens interstate commerce, but I think it also symbolizes a change in how countries in the region are viewing the durability of the US dollar and kind of the geopolitical ecosystem that props it up in the long run. This is not to say that countries are going to drop the dollar, but I think there are views that were shared in the 1980s, for example, that are being reignited now, particularly because of this competition between the US and China. And two, how the US should adapt to this. Far be it for me as a non-American citizen to advise the US government, but I feel that there might be some resistance to this changing world order for the United States. And we're already seeing this, of course. But I would urge maybe US policymakers to just take a step back and instead of reacting, maybe just listening to what countries in Southeast Asia and the rest of the global majority world have to say, have to think about what is giving rise to this sentiment of change, and to reflect on that in projecting what kinds of actions the US might take to adapt.
Well, listen, Elina, we have, alas, run out of time. So I want to thank you very much for the time that you've taken, and I do hope you'll come back and see us again.
Thank you so much, Sarwar, for having me. This has been fun.
And I want to thank our viewers from around the world. Please join us again on Polaris-Live.com as we continue to explore the most consequential relationship in the world, that between the United States and China and its impact on the world. Until then, goodbye.